Hello, welcome to the latest in the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows webinar series. And for this month, we are talking about cultivating leadership in competitive intelligence. And I am just thrilled to feature this month, Dr. Helen Rothberg. And some of you may be familiar with Helen Rothberg. She's got this book out here that we'll talk about in a second, and Dr. Rothberg has been, I think, a phenomenal influence in CI practice. But because of her humbleness, she has been under the radar, I think, for a lot of people. I have to say that while we will be talking about leadership today, I've been following Dr. Rothberg since the 90s when she and G. Scott Erickson had published some seminal works in CI and knowledge management. And I still say that that this work, and in particular the first book that they had published, is one of the most underrated CI books I've ever encountered. And but it's one that I use every single CI course that I teach. So academically, and so I feel that it's really important for me to say that because while we're talking about leadership, Dr. Rothberg covers so much in terms of business strategy, organizational behavior. Her pedigree is just rich and full of life, as you will see. And you see with her bio here that she's accomplished, and this is really just scratching the surface. She has a depth of experience with working with companies, and so she's more than just an academic. She has real life experience in bartending, as we'll talk about in a bit, but certainly in application in real corporate settings, and so we'll be deriving a lot of our discussions from that and drawing wisdom from her experiences and her research as well, and as well as her bartending experience. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Rothberg, and would you like to say a few words as we begin?
First, thank you. That's a really lovely introduction. Certainly call me Helen. And you've always been very supportive, and I appreciate that. I have been in the field for a while and straddling both parts of the world. And it's been a very rewarding ride so far. So it really is my honor to have joined the Council of Fellows this year and to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, and it's rewarding for us as well, because we've certainly learned a whole lot from your work. And while we won't be focusing so much on the research, the formal research you've conducted today, because we're really talking more about leadership and drawing on your various experiences, I do feel that it's important for us to acknowledge that, as with most webinars, but I think this one especially, we're really just scratching the surface, and so I do look forward, to being able to continue this conversation and just to view this as just a start, because leadership is such a broad topic, and it's also such a complex one. And what I love about your approach to this is that you have distilled leadership into wisdom and into a frame, and so I think that it's easier for people to take the first step if you haven't thought about leadership in a more formal fashion, and it's also more accessible. So in the book you presented the advice framework, and so ADVICE. Would you like to speak on that a little bit and explain to us why you had taken that framework and what that means?
Sure. So let me begin by, here's a spoiler alert for anyone who chooses to read the book. The punchline is you need to lead yourself before you can lead anybody else. And when we have people leading themselves and then leading others, really great things can happen. And the advice model does come from my bartending experience. So I spent 10 years in New York City as a bartender while I was going to college and graduate school. And I realized that was a microcosm of life. And the more I consulted and the more I taught and the more I engaged with people, I began to realize I was just bartending in a different place. And what do bartenders do? They give great advice. So the advice model is the acronym, or the cocktail, if you will, for leading yourself. A stands for action. The lesson there, do more and say less. D is determination. getting things done with civility and ingenuity, never stepping on somebody else to make yourself higher. V is vision. Vision really drives everything. If it doesn't, then you can have many mighty ships in the armada sailing strongly in circles, right? You need a vision to help point to true north and create a wake. I is integrity, and that's about telling the truth always and not creating drama. And if drama is created, try not to play into it. And if you do play into it, own what's yours and move on. Forgive yourself. C, communication is about creating understanding, which, at least in my consulting work, my educating work, even writing, it's probably the hardest thing to do well. And E is empathy. Daring to care about others and yourself. And then there are two sidecars, because every good cocktail has sidecars. Stand in your own shoes and be who you really are. You know, sometimes when we're at work, we think we have to be someone else, or we try to be who our clients or our bosses want us to be, and that doesn't work out so well. Oscar Wilde would say, be who you really are, because everybody else is already taken. And finally, the last sidecar is shape-shifting, and it's about change and being able to manage change, create change, and help others change. So that's the advice cocktail.
Right, and that it's fantastic, because it's certainly, you know, it's a framework that's very easy for us to remember. And so when we're talking, your book presents a lot of other scenarios from Simply CI. It really talks about various types of management scenarios, and you make a distinction between leadership and management with every single advice step. And I appreciate that, because it not only provides a reinforcement, but it also, I think, helps obviously, you know, to make that distinction so that there's more clarity in how we practice. And so, can you talk about the importance of that for folks who are really good at managing, but need to focus more on the leadership aspect, especially those of us who are very analytical. And tend to take, you know, really more of that approach to to our work and our CI delivery.
Yeah, sure. Because, you know what, management is about really getting things done and checking things off the list and helping others get things done and meeting deadlines. And so much of our lives, not just our work life and our project life, but our entire life is one big management project. Many of us are also parents and also daughters or friends, or have private practices, have families, have ourselves. And we're always trying to squeeze in more and make things move in a certain direction. And I think when you get lost in the day-to-day of getting tasks done or getting the analysis out, you forget, the bigger purpose of why you're doing it, how perhaps you can do it better, and how you could do it with more meaning. And leadership is about really looking forward and asking those bigger questions. Where are we trying to get to? What purpose will this really serve? How do we help ourselves get there the best way we can? How do we help others get there with us? That's a lot different than how do I get it done? You know, I have the chapter of vision. I'll pull a little phrase out of the book. You know, leaders could get things done in the dark. I'm sorry, managers get things done in the dark, but a good leader turns on the light. And when people can be inspired and they know what they're reaching for and are reminded which part of the wheel their cog is part of, it just provides people with a much more motivated and holistic approach to what they do. It's more satisfying.
And to build on the analogy that you just presented us, you had also mentioned at one point in your book, and I know that some folks haven't read it yet, so we won't go too much into these stories, because I just have to say that these stories are so rich, and it's some of the best storytelling I have ever read in any business book. And literally after, there was one point, and I'll admit, it brought me to tears. So I laughed, I cried, it's but also there's a lot of practical experience, and there's a lot of insights to it too. And so to build on the light analogy, you would also mention the importance of vision, and how you can have, you're working with a client who who was able to turn on the light, but there was no light bulb. And I thought that that was so profound. And so for the CI practitioner who is very sincere about leading, adopting terrific leadership skills, sometimes we're in a difficult situation where there is no light bulb, where organizational leadership isn't as equipped to lead. So what advice do you have for the CI practitioner who has these skills, who wants to do well, and just hits that roadblock?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a really hard situation. And I've worked with people who have been in those spots, and I've been in those spots. So I have a couple of answers for that. One is, first you have to find the light for yourself. And if I would say this, if you're doing work that you feel is not meaningful, that is not really going to help make a company more competitive, what does that really mean? Helping a company be more competitive means you're really protecting the livelihoods of everybody who works in that company, and their families and their communities and all of those things. It's not just a small thing. So if you can't find that light for yourself, what you're doing, why? That's a problem. So start with you. And then to start with others, I think what sometimes we do as consultants or as operatives is, if we're working with someone who doesn't get it, we have to try to turn the light on for them. Sometimes we have to be the light bulb, and you have to be very careful, because when you're dealing with people in different levels, it could be dicey and political. But there's no reason why things can't be framed or positioned to reflect something in that senior person's thinking or approach that you could then connect what you're doing to. So they might not have asked you to do an analysis, and they might not have wanted to know the so what if they did ask you to do an analysis, but analysis without so what isn't really analysis, right? We have to tie it to a bigger picture. But sometimes, you have to really think about who you're dealing with. Communication, speak to them in the language they understand, and frame what you're bringing them in a way that almost makes them feel they inspired it. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can help people above you find their own light and find that light bulb by being a little bit more generous in how you approach them. And then sometimes, honestly, people just aren't going to find the light, right? So first you try to find it in yourself, and then you try to really be observant and understanding of who you're working with, the empathy side, so you could communicate better with them, so maybe they can then elevate themselves. And then sometimes you really can't. And then it's your choice as a person working in such a space to decide to either try to work for someone who does get it, or, as I recommend in my first story in the introduction, get a new job where you can do something where you feel like you matter. Because I know there are these practical concerns in life about paying our bills and taking care of our families. But if you're good at what you do and you bring value, you're going to find that work. And if you stay in a place where you're not being seen and you don't feel like you can lead yourself to something better, it's not going to work well anyway.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And it was one lesson I had to learn as well in my early days. And I'm sure many others. Yeah, it certainly is. And in addition to understanding where our limitations are, leading ourselves, what advice do you have for CI practitioners who are in a situation in which they're not ready to quite leave yet? They're still assessing the situation. Perhaps there's still contributions they can make, but they need to shore up their leadership skills. They don't have a Helen Rothberg next to them advising them, as some of your clients do in the book. So what can you recommend for people who don't have you on speed dial and still really want to be able to develop their leadership skills robustly and certainly as quickly as possible?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that, I've been doing a lot of speaking this month for Women's Month, and this has been a big theme in some of our talks. You have to choose first. You have to choose to want to do it. And then you have to get out of your own way. Because if you're smart and you're analytical, and CI analysts are smart analytical people, you can rationalize all of the reasons. You could put together the whole landscape of data of why anything you do isn't going to work. And I would say at some point you got to stop that, right? You have to choose that you're going to do it differently. And if building your leadership skill is really about leading yourself, then ask yourself, okay, maybe I can't get this big impact that I'm trying to get, but maybe there are some smaller things I can do that might add up to a bigger impact. So start with something smaller where there could be a nice small success, and take action and get that done and bring others along. Invite others in to do that with you, help them think about it in a certain way, and that way you're not only leading yourself, but you're seeing how to engage a team in a good way. Really take the time to learn about the people that you report up to, not just from their bios, because bios are creative writing. And if you do a little work, and it's so much easier now, with the internet and even talking to other people, to really try to connect. The first thing I ever do when I walk into someone's office is I look at their shelving and what's on their bookshelf and what's on their walls and what's on their desk. And somewhere in there is a key to unlock a little bit deeper of a relationship. So if you see a book on fishing, or you see a picture of people's children, or some kind of special glass paperweight with a butterfly in it, there's something in there. There's a reason that's there, and you could start a conversation that helps you understand. I'm not saying you go out and have drinks with that person, although that doesn't hurt either sometimes, but this is part of building your leadership skill, is your skill of observation of how to connect, because at the core of anything you're going to do is communication.
Yes.
Communicating up is really, really hard, because it's a combination of deference and authority. And those are two opposite poles, right? So you're the authority because you're doing all this analysis. You have to have deference because they are your quote unquote boss or client, or whatever language you like to use in your company. And if you really want to develop that leadership skill, you're going to figure out how to connect to them. And I think those are probably two of the biggest things that I've used in my career that were really helpful to then enable me to do the rest of it.
Yeah, and so much of what you say, it's really about people. It's about connecting. And those aren't skills that we tend to learn formally through our academic training, when we're getting our MBAs and you're getting our MSLISs, and we're
right.
They
don't teach any of that.
Right. And so how would you recommend, and also I think in our field, we emphasize analysis so much. And you're a person who's highly analytical, extremely savvy in that regard as well. But you're still able to penetrate that and to see the people and to read situations. So you're able to combine that. Well, how would you recommend people develop those skills if they're not Helen Rothberg with the path that you've had and so forth? How can we do to cultivate that?
Well, you could pretend bar for a year, but that's another story. If I were a queen, everybody would work service for a year. I go back to what I originally said, is that you have to choose to want to do it first. It takes energy. It takes time. You're not always going to be successful at it. But I think what begins to happen, Cynthia, is when you have that first little breakthrough with somebody, that first little, you found the little crack into the vault. It's intoxicating, because it then makes you understand that, okay, there's more here. I could get more done now. Because when people connect, even if you're managing up, if someone connects with you in a way that feels real, they're going to be more willing to hear you. They might be more willing to let you take risks. So if you want to cultivate that, you have to cultivate that in yourself. And some of it means looking at yourself and asking yourself, what in some of this is really my own? What do I have to take ownership in my own behavior or my own thought patterns or my own belief or my own, and that comes from your past experiences and your energy and everything else that goes on in your life. But you have to first own what's yours. So then you could see, okay, maybe I need to shift this a little bit. Maybe I need to take the time, the energy to do this, and start with your friends, which is safe. And go into someone's house and look around, or be out to lunch and maybe just ask some kinds of questions about them that normally you wouldn't ask. I'm not saying you have to know about someone's intimate life, but you can be more personal in a way that's approachable and not threatening. And you practice like anything else. You practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I find that having a team to support us in being more open and in growing helps. And I know that for many CI practitioners who are solo, we don't have a built-in CI team. And so finding virtual teams, finding outside colleagues, as I have with many of our CI fellows, for example, helps, to lend these perspectives and to stretch ourselves. And so how much of that have you cultivated as you are coming up as well?
But Cynthia, there's a lot of ways to build a team, right? Yeah. And so some of it is also about sometimes approaching people and asking them for a perspective, even if you don't think you need their perspective.
Yes.
But inviting people in, letting them know that you think they have an expertise or an understanding. People like to feel recognized. They like to be included. They might not want to dedicate, 25% of their time to something, but they like to answer questions. They like to be seen as maybe an expert. When I originally entered this field in the 90s under the tutelage of the infamous and lovely Ben Gilad, I learned that from him, that probably the most powerful piece of the work that would be done is from the informal network that gets created by identifying, who really knows certain things, or who's experienced in certain areas, or who's traveled to certain countries or worked in other places, and just asking them for perspective, not asking them to do the work, but asking perspective. And you'd be surprised, like weaving a beautiful spider web, yeah? How you begin to connect with people, and then out of the blue sometimes, they'll just reach out to you and say, hey, I just heard this or learned this or saw this. Is this useful? And it happens in a very informal way. And I think something you said was really important, that often CI analysts are very isolated, and they work alone or only with one other person, or they're known as the person you send your stuff to and they go do it, which is then upon you to open up that perspective in a very different way. So that's how I did it, and that's how I recommend it.
Absolutely, this is terrific, and I just want to draw people's attention to the chats, because we have some terrific insights here. Actually, I just want to say that Christine has also reminded us that the first rule of every first responder, is that it's making sure the scene is safe for all before the first responder enters. And I know that that's referencing something we had talked about before, but it's also it is a part of this was part of what I had seen in the stories that you were told, is that situational awareness, right, is so important, that while we are often trained to train our attention externally as CI professionals, and that tends to be our foci as practitioners, the situational awareness internally within our own operating environment is tremendously important to everything that you've been talking about. And so how would you say, how important is it for folks to, in a sense, do CI on their own organizations, right, as they're taking temperatures and so forth?
Oh, what a question. So I am of the school, so I'll own this up front, that I think the majority of the most meaningful bite of intelligence you will ever find is already inside your own company. Right. I always found it funny as a consultant that I'd be asked in, and I'd be, I'm told there's a problem, and usually what you're told isn't the problem at all, and you find what the real problem is, but you talk to a lot of people in the company, and you diagnose stuff, and you make recommendations, and people say, oh my God, you're so smart. I'm not so smart. I just talk to the people who work here. You know, usually the wisdom, the language I like to use, the wisdom is in the room. And there are people working inside your own companies who have worked for your competitors, who have traveled to places where you're trying to break into markets, who have perhaps been schooled in things you can't even, who have degrees you couldn't even imagine. And, you know, this is where building that network and maybe even, and so here I bring in my early life of integrating CI and KM, knowledge management, but having a good, almost human resource inventory system where you understand people's backgrounds and you understand what they know helps you navigate your own organization so well, because you're going to find those beautiful morsels, maybe that last piece of understanding or insight right there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And being able to lead a team, and even a distributed team within your own organization, to be able to pull this together, and so that's a form of leadership as well, right? Yeah, and we've got other comments here. You know, that Ellen Naylor has mentioned, that some good advice to start with is, something small to shine in helping others, which reinforces, what you said as well, and taking the time to learn, the people who you report up to. And so you've got folks out here, who is supporting that. And then JP has also referenced a great article early this month about how to kickstart meaningful conversations that people might find helpful. So he's posted a link there as well. So we've got.
That looks terrific. I noticed that, and
yeah,
there's some good conversation. I'm paying more attention to you, but as you're saying this, and I'm looking, it's like, wow.
Yeah, no, it's terrific, because I think it's really sparking connections with a lot of people, and people are identifying with this too. And I just want to encourage the audience to pose questions. I know that I've been plying Helen with lots of questions of my own, but I know that some of you have your own experiences to share. And if you have a particular situation or question that you want anonymized, you can send it to me and via the chat, and I can mask it. So we can certainly.
Can I make one comment based on something you said before that I thought was so important?
Sure.
As an analyst, you would never send a company or a product to a new country without investigating it. You wouldn't launch something new without trying to figure out how competitors are going to respond, right? That's at the core of what we do. Mm-hmm. So why would we ever think to go and deliver a product to somebody we know nothing about?
Right. And actually it speaks to Jim Miller's point. He just posted, knowing who other people know is so important, why certain decisions are made.
Absolutely.
So, understanding how these decisions are made, right, will allow you to customize your project, and understand also the barriers, right? Because it's just because we've encountered, most of us have encountered the situation where we've packaged a terrific piece of intel, and people aren't necessarily receptive to it. Right. And so we can certainly lay the groundwork for internal leadership in this sense, but also there's that project level leadership, as well. And developing that awareness of our customers is so important. So yes, thank you for sharing that. And also Ellen says understanding their motivation.
Yes.
Now, one thing that I do want to touch on is that knowing your story, how important it is. And in fact, I remember, I think in a conversation we've had, that what I see in the stories that you've told is that very often you have a goal set. You know what you want to achieve, Helen. And you combine that with your own sort of brand of savvy chutzpah, and you certainly follow through. I mean, you put things into action. And from there, opportunities come. From there, right, we see new things emerge. And so I just want to throw that out there for folks to think about, and certainly for you to comment on, Helen, because I know that for us as practitioners, oftentimes, we're very thoughtful people, and we're people who are also, many of us are introverts as well. And so we don't often, sort of go out there and kind of do the sharp elbow, or kind of go out and challenge, the status quo as you have. And so, what can you recommend for folks, who, aren't wired like Helen, but for whom this type of these traits could be very, very valuable.
Well, thank you. There's a lot that goes into that, and some of that was, desperation and fear could be great motivators. And
Yes.
I grew up in a challenging space, and that was part of it. But I also, two things, you have to believe that you can. No one's ever going to do it for you.
Mm-hmm.
Your parents could love you, your siblings could support you, your mentors at work can start to open doors, but only you can walk through those doors. And I always had a forward momentum because I always wanted to move forward, and I had to shapeshift along the way. I knew I thought I was going to be a medical doctor, and that's all my base. I never went near a business course until graduate school, and I knew what I had to do, and I even took organic chemistry, for God's sakes. Don't ever do that. I worked in hospitals and realized, oh, this really isn't for me. And so what's next? And I kept trying to find what's next. And sometimes I stumbled into it. I wound up taking business. When I left biology, I became biopsychology. And then I realized being a psychologist was going to put me in the same spot as a doctor. So then I went to something called industrial psychology, which was kind of psychology in the business world. And I got an undergrad in that. And then there was some MBA program that had an industrial psychology major, and I got a scholarship. I had no idea. I'd never taken a business course. And I fell into it. And then I fell into strategy really at the very beginning. On one of the first years I graduated, PhDs in strategy. And I just kept moving with it. What I knew was no one was going to do it for me. I had to do it for myself, and I really wanted it. If you don't really want something, you're not going to do it. It's pretty, any of you who have kids know this. If they don't want to do it, they're not doing it unless you threaten them, right? So I really wanted it. I wanted to be able to live independently and live better and use my brain. I like to think. I originally thought I was going to be a writer. It took me 50 years to get there. But if you want it, you keep going. And if you are more introverted or your energy level is a little lower, and by the way, I don't drink coffee. This is me without caffeine. Ask yourself the questions of, what will it mean if I don't keep moving forward? Will I start moving backward? Entropy does begin to set in. And sometimes that could be scary, and there we are. Fear could be that great motivator. I really believe as people, we're put here and we only remember what happens when we're here. So there's a lot to experience and a lot to do. And if you look forward and you believe that you can, you will figure out how to do it. If it's really out, like, I'm never going to be an astronaut. Would I love to go into space? Sure. Can I be an astronaut? Probably not. But can I still look up at the sky and find what's next and get a telescope and enjoy the stars that way? Sure, I can. If you understand what drives you and what you enjoy, you'll figure out a way to create something close to what you want to experience. Sometimes it's easier to know what we don't like, but that could be a motivator too. Then how do you get to do something differently? You don't like the kind of work you're doing? How can you personally redefine it in a way that still fulfills the need of your organization, but will be much more satisfying to you? You know what? If you do that, you'll probably be innovating something that will help everybody in the end.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I guess my shorter answer is believe that you can. And then the first letter in the cocktail, right? Action. Do more and say, let's go do something about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's terrific. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we talked about as well in past conversations is just the importance of being able to tell your story, to create a connection and resonate with folks. We talked about communication, as Christine had said in the chat here, the big C. But the stories that you tell, I think, are just terrifically resonant, human. How can we become better storytellers as CI practitioners, understanding that the way that we present our intel oftentimes requires, connecting with folks and actually even eliciting an emotional reaction, right, in our decision makers, even if they don't think they're emotional people, right? And so can you speak more about the role of storytelling in leadership and in
Sure. I've learned an enormous amount about this in the last few years because, I've worked with professional editors now. When you're an academic and you write books, you have copy editors. When you write articles, you just have nasty people who edit you, and that's okay. You're all in it. But when you work with a major publisher, you get multiples of editors, and also now writing with money, I have to learn how to say everything between 600 and 800 words. And what I've learned about storytelling is a couple of things. One, only write about what you know and understand. It's really, really hard to tell a story about something you really don't know and understand. Two, only include what's necessary for the story. So one thing I learned in writing this book, The Perfect Mix, there was many versions of this book. This book was a decade in the making. And I had some characters that I loved, and I had to kill them. I had to pull them out of the book because, editors told me, yeah, this is fun and it's a great story, but it doesn't add to what you're trying to get across here. So I'm happy I didn't kill them. I actually put them aside for another book maybe. But, you have to be a good editor with yourself to say, just because I did all this work doesn't mean what I found and what I did helps me tell the story I'm trying to tell. Mm-hmm. It's not about showing everything you've accomplished. It's about what are you trying to help somebody else get to or understand, mm-hmm. and what really needs to be in there in the most simple, honest way for them to see it. I've also discovered that you should use a lot less words when you write reports. Look, one thing I know about executives, they're reading the first 5 words of the first sentence, and if you don't grab them there, maybe they'll give you 2 sentences, but you're not even getting a paragraph, right? So you have to be really honest, clear, upfront, and deliberate about the part of the story that you think will make the person you're speaking to pay the most attention to it, mm-hmm. which is, again, know who you're speaking to, right? Mm-hmm. That helps you. Different executives like certain numbers, they like certain words, they're more interested in different functions. But to be a good storyteller, less is more. Only use what's absolutely necessary. Be honest, tell the truth, don't cover anything. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this also, and you have to take a risk. You are opening yourself up. You're exposing yourself when you tell your story or a story. Mm-hmm. Whether if you're doing it in the setting of the CI setting, you are sharing a belief that you have put a lot of energy and time into. And it's mm-hmm. exposing the way you think about something and the way you might even feel about what should happen with it. Mm-hmm. And you've got to be willing to do that regardless of what that outcome will be.
That's really terrific, and I have to say that I think what you're saying is resonating with folks because the chats are just rolling in. One thing I keyed in on what you just said is about risk, and so for those of us who are in CI, and we are helping our users manage risk, right? And it's also quite risky sometimes to tell the truth, or to help them to see what is different from their own frames. And so, do you have any advice for our fellow practitioners, for how to manage that in ourselves, and even to how we can find the strength to venture into that area? Because I think our instinct is to stay in our comfort zone, right?
Yeah, I have a little decision model for myself. I always say, what good will come of it? This is whether I'm going to share or I should keep my mouth shut, right? Because those are 2 opposite ends of the continuum. What good will come of it? What's the greatest good for all involved? And how will I feel about myself if I don't? Mm-hmm. Can I live with myself? Can I look myself in the mirror? Mm-hmm. Some things are not worth falling on your sword for. Mm-hmm. And some things are. And if you really feel that you have done something and discovered something and have something to share of relevance to an important decision process, and you can put your story together in that tight, honest way, and you believe it's really necessary, how could you not do it? If you think it's really great, whatever, and it could really upset some people, and you really, you're not sure it has that much impact, maybe that's not where you choose to do that. But that's kind of how I do that. And it's hard, it's hard to work in an environment where people will discredit you or might ignore you. That might even be worse, or not use the work. So again, I go back to the storyteller and understanding their audience, and I hate to use this language, but I'm going to find the hook that will get the person who really needs to hear what you are sharing to pay attention.
Absolutely terrific. Thank you. And I want to just loop back to the chat a little bit because we do have a question. Lori has posed the question: how about what is needed to develop leadership when you aren't in a corporate environment but are working for yourself, and differences from those in the corporate environment? So as a consultant, you certainly understand that as well. So could you speak to that, leading as a solo operator?
Yeah, so it's really about leading yourself. And even though the model is called advice and V is in the middle, I always do start with vision. It's, what is it I really want to do? Where is it I could do the most good? Who is it I really want to try to work with? I don't like to say I work for.
Yeah.
And then going through the model, it's interesting. What do I need to do to get there, and where are my roadblocks going to be, and how am I going to get around it, and how do I avoid drama that might come in my way? I also, I want to say one other thing. I developed this workshop to actually address what was asked there as well. It's an exercise about doing a special kind of SWOT analysis on yourself, and saying to yourself, here's the vision. Here's what I want to try to accomplish. What in me will get me there, right? What are my strengths for getting there? What are my weaknesses that are going to get in my way? What outside of my control is opportunistic for that? And what outside my control is really challenging to that? And by assessing those things, and I have this whole other model, and I'll be happy to share it with people. But, you really have to ask yourself, am I going after the right things? Can I be aggressive about this? Do I need to change my thinking a little bit? Do I really need to walk away from something? So good leadership and leading yourself is knowing what not to do. Sometimes as much as what to do and what not to chase. As a consultant, I had to make a lot of decisions about what kind of companies I didn't want to work for, because I didn't feel it was a good fit with my personality or my belief system. So when you're on your own, it's a lot harder because you don't get as many of those outside rewards of people saying, hey, great job, or thank you. But, you could take track of yourself when you take that walk.
Yes.
Take walks all the time, or meditate, or 5 minutes with a cup of coffee, whatever people do to relax. And ask yourself, hey, am I doing what I want to be doing? And if not, what can I do to change that? Leading yourself is always about checking in with yourself and asking yourself, am I in the right place? Am I doing the right thing? What might I need to change? How do I go about changing that? So
that's great.
Yeah.
No, this is terrific advice, and I have to say, I can certainly vouch for that as well. And in my own practice, I make choices as well, and it's not just a type of choices of which types of customers to work with, because they're easiest, but also it's tied to my values. And I find that it helps you develop greater clarity and focus. And so it goes back to leading yourself. Those are foundations of leading yourself, as you say. And so I can certainly vouch for that. And I appreciate your sharing the framework that you use as well. because I think that should facilitate that for many of us who are doing this. And also I would say, internal practitioners as well, because those who are working in a corporate setting, you all be often having to make choices too. Perhaps not as many as those who are on the service side, external service side, but it's there, and so that's all great advice. And so I don't know if Lori, if you have any follow-ups to that. Oh, she says, Lori, thank you. This is very helpful. So I'm glad that was that answered your question. And anyone else too. We have about 15 minutes left, to the end of our session here, and I know we're just scratching the surface. So we'll have an opportunity to follow up in our LinkedIn community group. But this is the time where you're in front of Helen, and so you get a live answer to your questions. Just a reminder, if you're a bit shy about your question, you can certainly send the question just to me under the to field in the chat, and I can mask that for you if you don't want your name attached to your question. And one other thing that I'd like to touch on, Helen, is that you and I had talked about analysis before, and how analysis isn't a clear path in the way that many practitioners envision. That analysis itself has many facets, and not just in terms of the process of arriving at the analysis, but also just even deriving the answers themselves and delivering the answers. The idea that I think in a past conversation you'd mentioned it being more like a landscape. And so in that context, how can you recommend applying leadership skills towards developing stronger analysis to be able to understand that landscape and communicate that to our users? We've touched on that a little bit in our discussion today, but I think that tying that into more squarely into the practice of analysis and the idea that here we are as practitioners, we really do have a universe that we're having to make sense of. So how do you suggest that we draw that connection from the advice, the framework, and your experiences?
It's a great question, and it takes a lot of discipline, right? Because when you're building, I don't look at analysis as a thing. I look at it as part of a bigger landscape, right? Because there's so many different analyses that we need to do sometimes, even to point us in the direction of a decision or a choice. Sometimes it's easy, and sometimes it's not. And I think first we have to be very honest about where our favorites lie. Mm-hmm. Some of us enjoy doing certain kinds of analyses more than others. Some of us enjoy, right? We have our favorites, right? And you can't always just go to what, sometimes you got to eat the peas and carrots too, right? And you have to be willing to approach something from a very broad perspective to make sure you're not missing anything, and then see if you could find, if you will, proofs for yourself. I teach this one short thing at the Intelligence Academy, which is testing management assumptions, and it's everybody believes about what is critical to be successful in a certain strategic group, and you could do a whole what we call KSF analysis, and different strategic leaders are going to think different things are more important because that's their background. That's what they like the best. That's what's gotten them success in the past. And you could disagree. And I talk about running both of those kinds of analyses and then doing a very quick financial analysis to see, well, if that's really true, then how come the competitor's financial performance is so different than ours, right? Mm-hmm. So you can use, and a lot of people don't like to go to that F word, right? They don't like to look at the financials and go to the balance sheets. But if you know how to just look for a couple of small things and align them, all of a sudden it's a different landscape. It's, wow, well, if what you're saying is true, then we're leading the other four competitors, but we're number 3 in earnings. Something's not right here. Something's not right in our thinking. So pulling in different perspectives, even those that we're not totally comfortable with, mm-hmm. and might not like very much because maybe we're not good at it, good opportunity to bring in someone from the informal network to help advise you a little bit. that can help you keep you, if you will, honest and keep the landscape fresh. And also always asking yourself in the approach to be broad, at what point are you too afraid to pull the trigger and say, I have my answer? At what point are you still looking for so many other things because you're not sure, you don't feel secure, you don't want to definitively say it's something, sometimes more is not better.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So how you build that landscape so depends on the question you're researching, of course, but more is really not always better. So.
Right. And of course, tying it back to knowing your users and so forth as well.
And also, what question are they trying to answer? There's always, analysis should never just be occurring out in the universe. There usually is some kind of strategic question or need that drives it. And that will give you, if you will, the business case boundaries of what you should be including or what you should be looking for and how to be approaching something. So I think we could have that as a driver, then we don't get too lost in the sauce.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful. And Sam actually has just posted a note saying, showing the business case always should light.
Thanks.
Yeah, so he's.
I didn't even pay him to do that. That's great.
I know he's attuned to that, so that's wonderful. And then we also have Ellen saying, I find it helps to find out what analytic tools my audience uses to make it easy for them to understand what I'm sharing.
That's the big C.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Absolutely.
That's the language.
Yes. And so just a reminder, folks, we have about 5 minutes left. So actually, just under 10 minutes. So please post your questions for Helen. And I'd like to ask you about difficult situations. In CI, we find ourselves in difficult situations, sometimes ethically saying no, sometimes just politically as well. And so what would you recommend for people who are in those situations to use your advice model and apply that so that it can strengthen their positions? It can help to guide them through some of those stickier. Yeah.
So this sounds like a combination to me of integrity and standing in your own shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Each person has their compass.
Yes.
And you have to know what your compass is. And also know that if you're in a gray area, once your compass starts to move a little, it's easier for it to start to move a lot. Mm-hmm. So you as a person have to really understand who you are and what you believe and what you stand for, and let that guide you. I mean, some difficult situations are people related, and there are creative ways with integrity that you can work with people who are hard to work with in teams, or
right.
Who are don't always have integrity. I think I talk about one of those in the determination chapter. But it's really about knowing yourself. And if I can add one thing to that, in a strange way, your question also helps me add a little bit to what Lori had asked before about how do you lead yourself when you work on yourself. When you lead yourself and you give yourself permission to shine, that gives other people around you sometimes permission to lead themselves and to shine also. And when people see you having courage and integrity and standing up for yourself, or deciding to do something, or creating your next true north, or wherever you're putting your energy, very quietly, the people around you see you do that, and sometimes it gives them permission to do the same for themselves.
It's interesting to see that, because there's growing body of research regarding body language and leadership as well, right? We've got Amy Cuddy, and her power pose and that sort of thing. And so being aware of the visual cues that we're giving off as well, right? In various communications that we're having with folks. Yeah. So that's terrific. And so as we wrap up, we've got about 5 minutes left. I want to ask you, who have you looked to as leadership examples, role models? Who are some folks, who you've looked upon and learned from, either directly through your personal relationships or perhaps even virtually, some folks that we tend to read about in the business press or life press, because, the thing about the perfect mix that I love, and just I think your general approach, is that you integrate real life. It's not just business and life. And so who do you tend to look towards and admire?
That's such a good question. So I'll start with who my book is dedicated to.
Yeah.
And it's a simple dedication, and it's Thanks, Dad.
Yeah.
And I always said I got the strength of my intellect and my work ethic and my no-nonsense grit from my dad. My ability to relate to people and make friends and manage situations, probably more from my mom. My dad didn't suffer fools very well, but he was, a working class guy, and he was very hardworking, and he understood for himself that his role was to take care of this family that he helped create, and if he had to work 3 jobs, he did that. If he worked for someone who wanted him to do something that wasn't forthright, he would quit, even though it still meant, he'd have to feed his kids. He did what he said. He just did what he said. No nonsense. Sometimes it was hard to take when I was younger. But as I got older, I really understood that I always understood where he stood. He was not an enigma to me. He had no agenda. And I have really tried to model that in my life. I tell people I work with, friends even, don't ask me what I think unless you really want to know what I think, because you might not like what I have to say, and I'm going to tell you the truth. And in the end, it's easier because you know where I stand. So that I'd have to say I start there. The other place, and this is also going to sound strange, but is my younger brother, Russell, who he's almost 5 years younger than I am, but he's certainly an older soul. And he has always pursued his passion. And I haven't always done that. I was always the one more fearful about being able to eat and pay bills. And, I have more of that security driver. But he has always followed his passion, and he has always been next to my dad and along with my dad, I guess. Mm-hmm. My biggest supporter in do what makes your heart sing and don't be afraid. And when I tried to write this book, for instance, I went to Stuyvesant High School. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's a math and science high school in New York City. You have to take a test to get in. I was the 3rd year, they let girls in, and I had the blessing of falling into Frank McCourt's class, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and he woke up the writer in me, and that's what I was going to be. And I will tell you that by the time you become a full professor, you can't write a sentence. And anything about literature and literary thinking has been beaten out of you. And it took me 5 years to find my voice, and I was really going to give up, and it was terrible. And my brother was really instrumental, and my best friend from Stuyvesant High School, Liz, in believing that I could go back to that part of that girl and find her. So I would say those 2 people really have been, there weren't many role models coming up when I was coming up as a woman in the fields I was in. I've had incredible mentors. Ben Gilad was one of them. He, I think I have the distinction of being the only person who ever really consulted with Ben Gilad for years. He was a wonderful mentor, respectful, smart, no nonsense, as you all know.
It's no bullshit.
Bullshit, no bullshit. But so that's really, really from my roots. I'm so grateful.
I love that. I love that. And in fact, actually, it's funny because I'm looking at the chat, and August Jackson just said that too. And I love the way that he phrases it. So I'm so glad that this conversation is resonating with folks. And And I just want to mention that we mentioned this book, the Perfect Mix, Helen's latest book. It's in the business section, but I have to say, it just has it's probably got more heart than any business book I've ever read, and it certainly is a quick read. But importantly, it connects business with life. It integrates that in your approach and through storytelling, which I think makes it stickier in our minds, and probably easier to apply in that sense. And I think people might have gotten that sense from our conversation too. So I'm glad that we've had this chance to share with folks this conversation and the wisdom that you have cultivated over the years through your vast experience in research and as well as working with corporate clients. So I want to thank everybody who's joined us today and who shared your terrific thoughts. We've had a number of fellows here who have been providing resources and commentary as well. I look forward to sharing this with you all. When we have the recording ready, it'll be posted. And the link will be shared on our LinkedIn community group. So it's a Council of CI Fellows LinkedIn community group. If you're not there, please join us because we'll continue this conversation there. As many of you maybe think more about your own situations, have questions and comments to share. You can also check out Helen's LinkedIn profile as well as her website, and like I said, she's got a vast body of work. We're only scratching the surface here. So so I look forward to continuing this conversation, as well as for us to explore other works that Helen has produced in her vast experience, as well as producing. So thank you all very much. Please stay in touch, and we will end the recording shortly, and so we can, if you want to stick around and chat for a couple of minutes, we can certainly do that as well. So
thanks everybody for the opportunity to connect with you. I've really enjoyed my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And any final words, final thoughts for the audience?
Yes. Lead yourself because you can, and it's time.
I love that. I love that. That is
and
wonderful.
Cheers.
Thank you.